The winter of 1253 fell cold upon the Kingdom of England. Snow blanketed the cobblestone streets of London, and the frozen Thames carried the silence of fear. The banners of King Henry III fluttered above the tower, their crimson and gold reflected in the icy river below. Inside those towering walls, the king prepared to deliver a message that would echo across Europe. Betrayal would be punished not by death alone, but by horror. Henry III was not a cruel man by nature, but he was a ruler plagued by rebellion. His reign had been marred by barons who defied his taxes, by nobles who whispered treason in candlelit halls. England was restless, divided by power and greed. The throne he had inherited trembled under the weight of disloyalty, and every shadow seemed to conceal a plot. When the rebellion of William de Marais was uncovered, a noble accused of conspiring with the French to overthrow the king, the realm shuddered. William had once been a knight in the royal court, a man sworn to protect the crown. His betrayal cut deep. For Henry, it was not enough to kill the traitor. He would make him an example, a warning carved into flesh and history. The king's council gathered in the great hall. The archbishop demanded mercy, speaking of divine forgiveness, but Henry's eyes were cold as iron. "Mercy," he said, "is for those who serve their king. This man sought to break my crown in half. Let him feel what it means to be torn apart." His voice carried the weight of divine authority and the promise of terror. Word of the execution spread through the city like wildfire. Commoners whispered in markets, priests shuddered behind their altars, and even the guards spoke in hushed tones. Few had seen the punishment of quartering, for it was reserved for the gravest of crimes, treason against the throne. But everyone knew its horror, 4 horses pulling the condemned in opposite directions until his body was torn to pieces. The morning of the execution dawned grey and bitter. Bells tolled from the chapel towers, echoing across the frozen air. Crowds gathered near the execution grounds outside the tower, stamping their feet for warmth, their faces pale with a mix of dread and morbid curiosity. Among them were nobles and peasants alike, all summoned to witness what the king called justice. William de Marais was dragged from his cell, his body weak from days without food. Shackles clinked against the stones as he was led through the courtyard. His face, once proud and noble, now carried the hollow look of a man who had seen his death too clearly. Behind him walked priests murmuring prayers for his soul, though even their words faltered under the weight of what was to come. At the center of the field stood a wooden platform, soaked dark with past executions. 4 horses, restless and powerful, pawed at the frozen ground. Their breath rose in clouds against the morning air. Ropes were coiled around the posts, new, thick, and strong. The air smelled of hay, sweat, and something darker, anticipation. The herald read the charge aloud: treason against the crown, conspiracy with foreign enemies, intent to overthrow the rightful ruler of England. As his voice carried over the crowd, William's eyes fixed on the king's banner fluttering above the tower. "I served England," he rasped, his voice hoarse from thirst, "but not the tyrant who wears her crown." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Even chained, he defied the throne. The guards forced him onto the platform. His arms and legs were bound with thick ropes, each leading to one of the 4 horses. The animals shifted nervously, their handlers gripping reins tight to hold them still. A hush fell over the field. Even the wind seemed to pause, waiting for the king's command. Henry III stood on a balcony overlooking the scene, his fur-lined cloak fluttering in the cold breeze. He gave a single nod, the signal. The whip cracked. The horses lurched forward, muscles straining, hooves tearing at the earth. The ropes snapped taut, and William's body arched in agony. A scream tore from his throat, a sound that silenced even the loudest murmurs of the crowd. The horses pulled harder, their nostrils flaring, their eyes wild with fear and command. The first to give way was the shoulder, flesh tearing, sinews stretching beyond endurance. Blood sprayed across the snow, painting the white ground crimson. The handlers shouted, driving the horses harder, and the body twisted grotesquely. Bones cracked like branches underfoot. The sound was sickening, primal, unforgettable. William's screams turned to gurgled gasps, but his eyes remained open, fixed on the cold winter sky. One final pull, and the body tore apart. a wet, snapping sound that seemed to echo through every soul in attendance. His remains fell in pieces upon the platform, steaming in the cold morning air. The crowd recoiled, some turning away in horror, others crossing themselves in silent prayer. Children cried out, mothers clutched them close, and soldiers stood rigid, their faces pale beneath their helmets. The priests stepped forward to bless what was left of the man, though even their faith seemed shaken. Henry III did not flinch. His gaze was steady, his jaw set like stone. To him, this was not cruelty. It was order, the price of rebellion, the lesson written in blood for all who would think to challenge his rule. "Let all England remember this day," he declared, his voice carrying over the field. "This is the fate of those who betray their king." The remains of William de Moray were gathered not for burial, but for display. His head was severed and mounted upon a spike at the city gate, his limbs sent to the four corners of the kingdom, to York, Bristol, Canterbury, and Dover, as warnings to every noble and soldier. Each piece of him became a silent proclamation. The king's reach was endless, and his wrath absolute. That night, as snow began to fall again, the city lay silent. The blood on the execution field froze beneath the moonlight, a dark stain that glistened like black glass. The people of London prayed for their souls and for the mercy of a king who ruled not just with law but with fear. Far from the capital, in dimly lit castles and cold halls, other nobles whispered in dread. Some spoke of vengeance, others of surrender. All knew one truth. Henry III had shown them what it meant to defy the crown. And across the realm, the name of William de Moray became a curse, a reminder that treason did not simply end in death. It ended in dismemberment, disgrace, and eternal terror. The news of William de Moray's execution spread faster than any royal messenger could carry it. From the frozen alleys of London to the far reaches of the English shires, whispers filled every tavern, chapel, and castle. The tale of a man torn limb from limb by horses became more than gossip. It became a symbol of fear. And across Europe, kings listened. In France, King Louis IX, pious and severe, heard of the English king's brutal method of justice with both horror and fascination. France, too, had suffered its share of traitors and schemers, especially among the nobles who still dreamed of greater power than the crown itself. Louis, known to history as St. Louis, believed that God's order required absolute loyalty. To rebel against a monarch, he said, was to rebel against heaven. In 1259, when a knight named Guillaume de Ponthieu was accused of conspiring with English agents, Louis chose to follow England's example. He declared that the punishment for treason must be so dreadful that no man would ever dare commit it again. He called it the Justice of the Four Horses, and the name itself made courtiers shudder. The square before the Cathedral of Notre Dame was chosen for the spectacle. Wooden barriers were erected to hold back the crowd, and soldiers lined the streets. Paris had seen beheadings and hangings before, but never this. The people came in silence, drawn not by curiosity alone, but by a dark need to witness royal power made flesh. Guillaume de Ponthieu was dragged before the king, his once fine armor stripped away, his tunic torn. The accusation was read aloud by a royal herald. For the crime of high treason against his sovereign, Guillaume de Ponthieu shall suffer death by quartering, that others may learn the cost of rebellion. The words echoed through the square like a prayer of damnation. Louis IX watched from a raised platform, his expression calm, his eyes cold with divine certainty. He held a rosary in one hand, murmuring silent prayers as the condemned was tied to the four horses. Around him stood priests, courtiers, and judges, all cloaked in the belief that this was holy justice. The signal was given. The handlers cracked their whips, and the horses strained forward. The sound of ropes tightening filled the air. Guillaume screamed, a sound so raw it silenced even the children. The horses pulled again, muscles rippling beneath their hides, hooves scraping against cobblestones slick with blood. The body stretched, bones snapping audibly, until one arm gave way with a crack like splitting timber. The crowd recoiled, but the king did not turn away. He watched as the four horses pulled until the man's body was ripped into pieces, his blood running down the stones of Paris. The priests chanted softly over the carnage, their prayers almost drowned out by the restless murmurs of the people. Some wept, others crossed themselves, a few fainted. None would forget. When the execution ended, Louis ordered the remains burned. "Let no relic of the traitor remain," he said, his voice steady. But as the smoke rose over Paris, even his most loyal men could not meet his gaze. They had seen what royal justice could become when sanctified by vengeance. The execution by quartering began to spread beyond France and England. In the German principalities, where dukes and electors fought over borders and allegiance, it became the preferred punishment for conspirators. Each ruler saw in it a tool of fear, a way to make treason unthinkable, not just illegal. In the city of Cologne, Emperor Frederick II's envoys introduced the punishment to quell rebellion among mercenaries. The first victim, a captured commander accused of plotting mutiny, was executed before the cathedral steps. His screams echoed across the Rhine as crowds watched in horror, convinced they were seeing the wrath of God itself. By the late 13th century, the execution by quartering had become a macabre ritual throughout Europe. Each ruler gave it their own flourish of terror. In Spain, torches were lit around the condemned, and the ground beneath the horses was salted to keep them agitated. In the Holy Roman Empire, the executioner sometimes nailed the traitor's tongue to his chest before the pulling began, so that he could neither beg nor curse. Yet not all were silent in their fear. In monasteries and courts, scholars debated the morality of such brutality. Was this justice or blasphemy? Could a Christian king truly claim to act in God's name while tearing a man apart like an animal? But their voices were whispers against the roar of royal power. Kings found comfort in the spectacle. It was not only about punishing one man, it was about ruling through terror. Every noble who watched knew what awaited them should they defy their sovereign. Every peasant learned that the crown was divine, untouchable, absolute. Fear was the mortar that held kingdoms together. In England, Henry III's son, Edward III, inherited both the throne and the lesson. He was a warrior king, fierce and ambitious, ruling through both sword and law. Under his reign, the execution by quartering reached its most infamous form. He declared it the punishment for treason against the crown, particularly for those who aided foreign powers or conspired to divide the realm. It was Edward who made the punishment ritualized, turning it into a sequence of horror. First, the condemned would be dragged through the streets. Second, they would be hanged but cut down before death. Third, their body disemboweled, their entrails burned before their eyes. And only then would the quartering begin. It was cruelty elevated to ceremony, a performance meant to display not just vengeance, but absolute control. Across Europe, this method became both feared and admired. Rulers from Hungary to Poland sent envoys to study England's methods of royal justice. Chroniclers wrote of it as though it were a divine invention, a punishment fit only for the blackest of souls. But in taverns among the common folk, the stories took on another tone. They spoke not of justice, but of nightmare, of men torn like beasts, of kings who watched with smiles, of priests who blessed the ropes that ripped men apart. They whispered that such rulers were cursed, that one day their cruelty would return to them tenfold. Still, no one dared speak aloud what everyone knew, that the line between justice and savagery had been erased. The sight of horses pulling at human limbs became a symbol of royal authority across centuries. The name of the punishment alone could silence rebellion before it began. And so, by the dawn of the 14th century, Europe lived beneath a single truth. Treason was no longer just a crime. It was an invitation to be destroyed in body and soul. The kings ruled through faith and fire, and the horses waited tethered and restless for the next command to pull. The square of Paris awoke to a hush that even the ravens feared to disturb. It was dawn, and the cobblestones were slick from the night's rain. At the center stood 4 massive horses, black, brown, chestnut, and white, snorting clouds into the cold air. Chains glinted between them, and in the middle lay the condemned, limbs bound tight, face pale but defiant. He had been accused of conspiring against the king, a traitor to the crown, they called him. The royal herald stepped forward, unfurling the decree with trembling fingers. By order of his majesty, this man shall be torn apart by 4 horses, his body scattered as a warning to all who defy the throne. The crowd murmured, half in fear, half in fascination. It was not the first such execution, but each time it felt like witnessing hell opening before men's eyes. Trumpets blared. The horses strained in place, hooves scraping. The executioner, clad in black leather, raised his arm. The ropes tightened, pulling the victim into an unnatural spread, arms east and west, legs north and south. The first command came, "Drive!" The handlers whipped the horses forward. The man's body arched violently, sinews bulged, bones groaned, and screams tore through the air sharper than any blade. The crowd flinched as one of the ropes went slack. The left arm had dislocated, tearing muscle from socket. Blood sprayed across the stones, dark and steaming. The second command followed, "Drive harder!" The horses lunged again, jerking the body into impossible tension. His legs gave way first. The sound was wet and dreadful, a ripping that echoed like thunder through the silence that followed. The man's head rolled back, eyes wide open toward the sky, mouth frozen in a cry that no longer came. One by one his limbs were wrenched free, torn from their joints, until the body was no more than a scattering of flesh and rope. The priest stepped forward, muttering prayers, though his hands trembled. The executioner gathered what remained, placing the pieces into baskets. These would be displayed on the city gates, each marked with a placard reading, "So perish all traitors." As the crowd dispersed, silence hung over the square once more. The king, watching from his balcony, turned away. His justice had been served, but even he could not ignore the way the horses trembled, nor the way the air itself seemed to mourn what had just been done in the name of power. Subscribe for more interesting content.